Hi, guys, and welcome to chapter 6 reading of Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. Um, Hope you're doing all right. Um, Please connect in with us and join us online on Facebook and YouTube. As you coming on, please can you just put a like and press share? That'd be brilliant. It's great having people with us this afternoon. And also, if you're watching or catching up at a later time, then I hope that this blesses you. Hey, Tash, good to see you. Or see your name anyway. We've been reading through all the chapters so far. I think it would be good if at some point we'll be able to do sort of some kind of podcast or conversation where people that have been reading the book, we can all have a little bit of a chat online about like the bits that God's sort of spoken to you guys the most and how it's challenged you through the Word of God and the story of Moses and things like that. So maybe have a think about that. Think about what maybe is challenged you through this and sort of the bits that make you think the most, and then we can discuss that and see if people, connected in the same way, or whether there's other things that have been challenged through that. How are people getting on with the book? Are people reading the book extra? Like, are you reading it aside to just us doing this time here together now, or are you reading it on top of that? Or is it helping you get into the word more? Is it challenging you, encouraging you? Stirring you to change certain things. Maybe just have a think about those kind of questions and let us know how you're getting on. Um, so let's just go straight into chapter 6. Chapter 6 is guiding others on the spiritual journey. Don't know how long this chapter is. It looks like a big one. So we'll see how it goes. So, scripture, it says, from the wilderness of sin, the whole congregation of Israelites journeyed by stages as the Lord commanded. Exodus 17, verse 1. So here we go. The best guide for any journey is one who has made the journey himself or herself, perhaps multiple times, and thus knows something about the terrain, the climate, the beauties, the dangers, the challenges that present at each point along the way. Part of what qualified Moses to lead the people out of Israel out of their bondage was that he had already been on his own journey out of bondage and into freedom to follow God fully. By the time God called Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he had already taken his own journey in the wilderness. He had traversed the wilderness territory of his own soul for 40 years, and he knew how to find God there. He had learned how to listen and then follow God's word to him. Moses' faithfulness to his own spiritual journey was the best possible preparation for leading the Israelites out of their long bondage and into the freedom that God had for them. The Exodus is a great metaphor for the spiritual journey, the journey from spiritual bondage to freedom in Christ that we take as individuals and also together as the people of God. It can be seen as a metaphor for the whole journey from salvation to finding our true home in heaven, but it can also be a metaphor for a time when God is calling us to greater freedom in a particular area of our life, or a time when God is calling us to leave familiar territory behind so that we can enter into something new. The places through which the Israelites passed on their journey serve well in helping us understand the stages of our own journey. These stages do not represent a linear journey where we arrive at some location and then we're done. Rather, they represent a cynical, that's not cynical, what's that? Cycle process that continues to move us in the direction of greater spiritual maturity and greater freedom and abandonment to God. This process will not be complete until we reach our final destination of eternity spent in the presence of God. It is one thing to inspire people to visions of what the promised land is like. It is quite another to understand the stages of the journey between here and there so that we can guide folks through them and actually arrive at our destination. Understanding the stages that we have passed through on our own journey is excellent preparation for leading others on the journey with gentleness and skill. An understanding of stages can help us instill confidence and provide reassurance during those parts of the journey that are challenging and difficult. Part of Moses' role as a leader was to lead the Israelites in each stage of their physical journey at the Lord's command. These are the stages by which the Israelites went out of the land of Egypt under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote down their starting point stage by command of the Lord, and these are the stages according to their starting places. Numbers 33 1 to 2. Many of the places the Israelites passed through on their physical journey correspond to the passages of the spiritual journey. Being able to recognize the markers along the way to help us provide guidance for this journey we have embarked upon with those we are leading. What follows is a description of the stages Moses led people through by God's grace with application to the spiritual journey as we experience it today. Pre-awareness. The first stage of the spiritual journey is pre-awareness. This is the time when, like the Israelites, we are not even aware that we are in bondage or that we need God to lead us into something more. There may even be good things going on. The Israelites were fruitful and prolific in Exodus 1:7. And we are lulled into believing that this is as good as it gets. At this stage, our way of life seems to be working pretty well, and we assume that this is the way everyone lives. This is the non-Christian person before they are even aware that they are seeking anything. This is the person or congregation that has been on the Christian path for a long time and yet now is having a sense that there must be something more. It is when we are on the verge of seeing a sin pattern or a part of the false self that we aren't quite ready to name because we know that it will rock the boat of life as we know it. Pre-awareness. In God's time, God begins to move us towards a new level of awareness. We might get an inkling and something is not quite right. A question bubbles up, a longing stirs. We spend time with someone who seems more free, more attractive, more healthy, or whole. We have a vague sense of disease, but for the most part, we are able to keep it outside of our awareness. The pre-awareness stage can go on for a long time because there is something comforting and secure about life as we know it. Because we are not ready to move into the unknown, we find ways to maintain the status quo, and in so doing, we abdicate responsibility for dealing with the issues of our lives. Like that of the Israelites, our bondage is familiar. If it is a way of life that makes sense to us given the level of understanding we currently have. It is a way of life that makes sense to give us the level of understanding we currently have. Pre-awareness. The awareness that something is going on in our life, that something is suddenly starting to stir, but before we are aware of what is coming, we are just in the bondage. We think life is the way it is. We think this is as good as it gets. We think that this is normal. And at this pre-awareness stage, is this the stage where we're in, where we're not quite aware of what is about to happen to us, but something is starting to stir. Something is starting to change. We find ourselves questioning the things that we're about to do. The patterns of life that are just seem ordinary and normal and everyone's doing them suddenly don't seem so great. So yeah, pre-awareness. I don't know if there's anything about if you guys. This can happen for someone that's a follower of God. It could also happen for people that are, um, what do you call it? They've been following God for a period of time, but they've got comfortable in what they are and where they're at. And God is shaking that, and I believe God is wanting to shake that in our nation today, amongst Christians and amongst non-believers. That He's shaking something in us to make us aware that He's wanting to do a work in us. And this stage here is that pre-awareness. Maybe you guys are going through that yourselves. Eventually, something happens that heightens our awareness that our heart is longing for something more. We realize that we are not completely free and we begin to at least open up to the possibility of moving in a new direction. This could be a single event or accumulation of events that we can no longer dismiss or ignore. For the Israelites, it was increasing oppression by both a king who did not know Joseph and the taskmasters who were carrying out his orders. This oppression was motivated by fear, as all oppression is. The Egyptian Pharaoh was afraid that the Egyptian Pharaoh was afraid that the children of Israel would become strong, fight against Egypt, and eventually escape. The king became so frightened of the potential power of these lively people that he ordered all the baby boys to be killed at birth. As the ruthlessness of the taskmasters increased and the bitterness of their lives became unbearable, the Israelites groaned under the conditions of their slavery. It was no longer possible to pretend that everything was as it should be. At the same time, God was already starting to prepare a leader to lead them out of bondage. Even before they were aware that they were in bondage, God was beginning to put the necessary components in place so that when the time was right, they would take their first step towards freedom with the support and guidance they needed. Meanwhile, Moses was going through his own process of struggling with awareness and trying to figure out what to do. Their journeys were running parallel with each other's, with each other's, even though they were not knowingly connected yet in any way. It was painful for Moses to see what he was seeing, but his initial attempt to do something about it had failed so miserably that he had run away and tried to hide. Not only was he running away from having his sin found out, but he was also running away from the responsibility that increased awareness inevitably brings. Out of sight, out of mind. That's the way it was for all of us. We might try to ignore what we've seen and hide from the responsibility that goes along with it. But if we want to get on with the spiritual journey, we must look at reality full in the face. Denial is a lot less painful than awareness. But if we remain in denial, we are left stuck in our bondage. In the awareness or the awakening stage, we wake up. We are willing to see the named truth more accurately. Leadership at this stage requires helping people have the courage to name reality and keep facing into it. In a congregation, it might be the reality that people aren't growing, or that young people are leaving the church, or that our pace of life is not working, um, and we as leaders are longing for more. In an organization, it might be that we have gotten away from our mission, or that our mission is no longer captures our sense of what we are called to do, or that we have slipped into patterns of working or relating that no longer life-giving. Or it could be helping individuals keep facing what is true in their own lives and taking responsibility for how that is impacting our lives together. Awareness always calls us to take responsibility for responding to what we are seeing, which is another reason that many of us seek to avoid awareness for as long as we can. But when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing, we are ripe for making a move. That's a good statement. When the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing, we are ripe for making the move. The emotions that we feel in response to what we have seen might be volatile during this time, but they serve good purpose. They give us the energy and resolve to begin preparing a move in a new direction. Awareness also involves being able to see the possibility of living in a new way, and oftentimes it takes a visionary leader or at least someone with a little bit further down the road to help us see what we have not yet been able to see. Another function of leadership is to help people get in touch with their longings and see their possibility of a new way. In the midst of the Israelites' growing awareness that they could not go on as they were, Moses and Aaron arrived on the scene to assure them that God had seen their misery and would empower them to leave Egypt and change their lives. In the awareness stage, all of us need those who help us see what is real about our current situation. But we also need someone who can assure us that there is another way and that it is possible for us to move in that direction, as risky as it might seem. That's a really good statement there. That actually the awareness is about sometimes other people making us aware of where we're at, and that God is telling them or talking through them to show us that we can come out of the bondage that we're in, that we can come out of the situations that we're in. The other thing I liked in that passage was when it basically said the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing. Up until that point, we don't really want to come to terms with admission. What was the actual wording it used? Denial is a lot less painful than awareness. In awareness or awakening stage, we are willing to see and name truth more accurately. Is coming to terms with what needs to be dealt with rather than denying that it needs dealing with. And we all are guilty of that. We're all guilty of not wanting to go to a certain area of our lives for God to deal with. We're aware of it being there, but we want to deny that it's even there and it even exists. But when we come to terms that it does exist and we are more made aware of it, and sometimes, like it says here, Moses and Aaron made the Israelites aware of their bondage, but also explained the way out, where they were heading. Sometimes we need people as well to help us with that. So we have a responsibility twofold, don't we? First of all, we have a responsibility to allow people, not just anybody, but to allow people to be a voice of God in our lives, to help us to sometimes see the bondage that we're in. And we also need to be bold enough and gracious enough to be able to tell people also that they are in bondage. We have a responsibility on two counts: one to listen and one to speak. Turning point. So the Israelites began to let themselves dream of the freedom to live together in a community that is free to worship and serve God freely. Martin Luther King Jr. let himself see a world in which black children and white children live together in equality without the clouds of segregation hanging over their heads. A person who becomes aware of how the pain of their past has twisted their relational patterns begins to envision what it would be like to face into the pain and come to a place of greater freedom on the other side. A person who has resisted surrender to God begins to envision that it would be like what it would be like to say yes to the spiritual journey. A person who has lived their entire life according to oughts and shoulds imposed on them by others begins to get a glimpse of what it would be like to live out of a truer self, and that has been called by God. A turning point has been reached. That you're no longer living a life according to other people's thoughts and processes that has been imposed on you, but you're starting to live out your truer self as God has called you. But things often get worse before they get better. While the Israelites' awareness was growing, the circumstances causing their sufferings got worse. Now they were required to make bricks without straw, and when they weren't able to keep up with their quotas, they were beaten even more brutally. The deterioration of our situation might seem like an unnecessary piece of the journey, but is actually an important part of the process because it brings us to a turning point where we are willing to do something about our situation. This is the straw that breaks the camel's back. This is the last thing that puts it over the edge for us. After this, nothing can be the same. Before this, we're waffling, tossed back and forth between awareness of our bondage and awareness of all we have to lose if we get up and make the needed change. At this point, things get pretty messy and chaotic. Like the Israelites, we might find it hard to listen to the voice of hope because of our broken spirit and our cruel slavery. This is very challenging time for the leader too, as he or she realizes things are not going to be quite as easy as we hoped. In Moses' case, the people were no longer listening to him, and he took it personally. It confirmed his worst fears about being a poor, ineffective speaker. He even had an I told you moment with God, a told you so moment with God. The Israelites have not listened to me. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me, poor speaker that I am? Exodus 6:12. But all of this was the darkness before the dawn. This is God's moment to come through as he does, with signs and wonders that will free us for the journey that is ahead. There's a saying here. It says, "It's good to be between a ruined house of bondage and a holy promised land." I really like this passage because what it's saying is sometimes we go through life and it seems like, why am I getting beaten? Why has this got worse? Why is this getting worse and worse and worse? Like suddenly you've gone from almost accepting life as it was and you're just getting on with what you're doing, and suddenly things start changing where you're uncomfortable in what you've been comfortable in. And I believe more times than not, this is God. This is God showing us, like, I'm stirring the pot. I'm stirring up what's going on in your life because I don't want you in this bondage. I don't want you here. And I'm stirring it up. I'm making you uncomfortable in the place that you've deemed comfortable so that you would change. And that's what was happening with the Israelites. That the Israelites were actually almost comfortable in what they were. And then things started to change around them. And they were always slaves. They were like almost always slaves in this situation, but suddenly it became more and more brutal and punishing. And suddenly they were awakened to where they were and who they were and what they were labeled as where they were kind of labeled it for quite a long period of time. But because it was a little bit different and it had been a lot calmer and a lot more peaceful, they hadn't noticed what they had become. They were meant to be the children of God, the representation of God on the planet, and yet here they were slaves to the world, and they hadn't quite understood that because it was quite comfortable, and suddenly their slavery had become uncomfortable. And that is if anyone's watching now and you're someone that doesn't know God, doesn't walk towards God, hasn't followed God, I believe that God's going to start shaking up your world right now in what you're in to make you feel uncomfortable in the very thing that you're comfortable in, to make you aware that you're actually meant to be a child of God and represent Him, and that He will stir your life in such a way that would turn your attention, the turning point, that you'll have a turning point in your life that would turn your eyes towards Jesus. I'm just going to have a bit of coffee a minute. How's everyone doing? The roundabout way. And they're off. The signs and wonders that God performs through Moses and Aaron, along with the plagues, have done their good work, and the Egyptians are happy to see the Israelites go. In the midst of much hoopla and celebration, they embark on an incredible journey. Their newfound freedom is really exciting at first. A deeper spiritual journey is after all what we have been longing for, and actually getting on the way is quite an emotional high. The victories that have been brought to us, brought to this point may even leave us with the sense that we are somewhat invincible. Nothing's going to stop us now, and we are ready for anything. After the stress of decision making and change, we are ushered into a time of spiritual flourishing, characterized by great enthusiasm, gratitude, vivacious learning, and service. God, in His kindness, leads us in such a way that at this stage we don't face challenges that are more than we can handle. God intentionally led the Israelites by the roundabout way rather than the most direct route because God knew that they weren't ready to take on the challenges that a more direct route would have brought. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of Philistine, although that was nearer, for God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness. Even though they might have preferred a more direct route to their dream, it was actually a great kindness that God prevented them from encountering more than they were ready to handle. The roundabout way may not be the most direct route, but it represents a wonderful era in the spiritual life when God shows up in a very tangible way that assures us of His presence. Um, assures us of our presence on the journey. Like the cloud by day and the pillar by night, visible signs of God's presence are never far away. In the Israelites' case, the presence of God mediated through these symbols never left its place in front of the people because the main purpose of this season was to protect them from the challenges they were not ready to face and to teach them through experience in day through experience day after day that the presence of God would never leave them. During this time, we settle into a period of normalcy where we learn what it is to live freely in the presence of God and to rely on the presence for our sustenance. The ability to rely on God that, that is being developed during this time is foundational to the spiritual life and will serve us well when the first challenge hits and we enter into the great and terrible wilderness. Although we may feel invincible based on our earlier triumphs, God knows that we are not. He knows that if we were to experience any real dangers, toils, and snares, we wouldn't be ready for them. One of the main lessons we learn during this stage of the journey is that God is not in any particular hurry to get us to the promised land. He is much more concerned about the transforming work he is doing in us to prepare us for greater responsibilities of freedom living. Onlookers may observe our journey and like Pharaoh, think we are just wandering around aimlessly, but God knows what he is doing. He is concerned about strengthening our faith so that we are prepared when there are real challenges to be faced. That a little bit there, although we may feel invincible based on earlier triumphs, God knows that we are not. He knows that if we experience any real dangers, toils, and snares, we wouldn't be ready for them. One of the main lessons we learn during this stage of the spiritual journey is that God is in not a particular hurry to get us to the promised land. He is much more concerned about the transforming work he's doing in us to prepare us for greater responsibilities of freedom living. What an incredible passage that it lines up very much so in line with what we're going through right now as a people. That God is not in any hurry to get you to your promised land. He is more concerned by transforming you, by doing a work in you, by preparing you and getting you ready for freedom living. I love that. See you in a bit. Onlookers may observe times of testing. I'm just going to have a bit more coffee. You're not going yet? Okay. Times of testing. And the challenges do come. Somewhere along the way, we are faced with our first real obstacle. It is usually quite unexpected, and we are not prepared for the Israelites. Their first obstacle was the Red Sea. We all know the story as they approached what appeared to be an uncrossable sea. They looked back only to find that the Egyptians had changed their minds and were pursuing them to take them back into slavery. Even with all that they had experienced of God's presence with them, their faith faltered. For the first time, they experienced real ambivalence about this journey towards freedom and what it was now requiring of them. They attacked Moses and accused him of bringing them out to the wilderness to die. They were convinced that God had abandoned them, and they longed to go back to Egypt where at least there was a bit more security. This ambivalence about the rigors of spiritual journey is a predictable part of any true journey. And it's helpful for us as leaders to know this so that we don't take it too personally. A wise leader can help people understand where they're at is a very normal response to the challenges of the journey rather than an excuse to run back to what feels more secure. It's important to realize that people's reactions had very little to do with Moses. Their reaction was more with where they were on their journey and what God was doing in them and the Egyptians through this challenge. While we should be hesitant to say God causes all the challenges that come our way, the scriptures do indicate that God created this situation to show his glory and strength to those who were in opposition and also the Israelites themselves. And this is indeed what happened eventually. But in the meantime, the Israelites were stuck and Moses was in a tough spot. You know, really important as you represent God, whether you're a leader, seen as a leader, or whether you're just, like I've said many times through reading this book, you are just a representation of him. If that is who you are, then people will blame you for a lot of things. They will attack you for a lot of things, for the things that are going on. But most of the time, it will be because of their fear. Sometimes people argue in marriages, in relationships, And usually it's not personal. It's not because the other one has done something wrong against the other. It's usually that one of the party is facing something, and they have fear or worry or anxiety or some stress or something that's going on, and therefore what they do is they they put that on the first person that they can find, or the person of responsibility, or in a marriage's case, you put it onto the person that's can be close to you. In this case, in church's case, often people will throw a lot at a leader or people that are in leadership, because that's the place to go to. That's the authority that they see. But they throw out some things and they attack what you're saying, because really what's going on is God saying, change. God's saying, trust me. And these people are the ones that bringing that message, like Moses was. Come on, God's got us. He's going to be okay. They attack that because their fear is greater in those moments. And that's important to know, because we can take a lot of things personally, believe me, and when we receive things back from people. But the truth is that actually we just need to be a people that, if we're leading, if we're in a place of responsibility, that just says, "Do you know what, I don't need to take it responsibility. I'm just delivering a message, or I'm just doing what I'm being obedient to what God's asking me to do." And how people respond is actually quite a human reaction. Some people will respond in a positive way, but some people will struggle with that. And we don't need to take it personally. We just need to stay faithful to God, keep on the path, because we can easily want to walk away, even as a leader, even as someone running a group or whatever you might be, or a follower of God, think, oh, I'd rather not do this. I'll go away. I don't want the stress, or I don't want to be unpopular, or I don't want to be not liked. But actually, the truth is, you don't even need to worry that that's what people think about you, because they probably don't. Majority of them probably don't. They're actually just expressing their fears or whatever other kind of emotion it is at that moment, and it's coming out in that type of way. Learning to keep still. This is the moment where we begin to see more clearly the relationship between Moses' journey into solitude and his effectiveness as a spiritual leader. Because of his encounters with God, Moses is now a fundamentally different person. Rather than the brash, impulsive, take matters into my own hand kind of leader that he once tried to be, he is now someone who is able to offer a deeply spiritual response in the face of grave danger. He knows that his soul is not going to be strengthened by getting caught up in the people's fears and complaints. Instead, he turns inward so that to that place where he has learned to seek God, and from that place he delivers this most counterintuitive message. He says, "Do not be afraid, stand firm and see the deliverance of the Lord, what the deliverance of the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians that you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to keep still." We ought not underestimate the raw human emotion and survival instincts that we are at work in this moment. The people were afraid for their lives, as well they should be. They were backed into a corner at this uncrossable sea, and the Egyptians who had abused and then murdered their children were now close enough for the Israelites to see the whites of their eyes. The people were threatening mutiny, and all their survival instincts were kicking in. When people get pushed to the edge, their fear, like this, is it can easily become a frightening and out of control situation. We've all heard horror stories of human stampedes at sporting events and in crowded public places when people feel there is a threat of violence or danger. What happens in that moments like that is a very primal human response that is exuberated by herd mentality. The Israelites were on the brink of this kind of disaster. When the leader starts to feel this kind of dynamic take over, it's an alarming thing, and one where great wisdom is required. Moses' effectiveness in this moment had to do with the fact that even though he was fully aware of the people's emotion, he was even more attuned to the reality of God's presence. He knew that the first thing he needed to do was to help people still themselves and learn to wait on God even in the face of their greatest fear. It reminds me of a scene from a movie in Braveheart when William Wallace is leading his ragtag band of Scottish soldiers into a battle for the first time. It is a situation very similar to Moses' situation. They too have come to a turning point where they are willing to do whatever it takes to gain their freedom. They too have no weapons, no chariots, no horses, no uniforms, none of the facilities of war that the opposing army has. All they have is homemade spears that they need to throw at just the right time, and they have to wait for Wallace's command. They know that timing was everything. If they throw these crude javelins too soon, they will fall in front of the opposition army. If they wait too long, the spears will sail over their opponent's head. The opposing army comes thundering towards them in the face of these untrained Scottish soldiers. One sees a combination of alertness, fear, readiness, courage, and will. Wallace is shouting, "Hold, hold, hold." And as a spectator, you're wondering if they will have the restraint to wait for exactly the right moment to launch their spears. Will they trust their leaders enough to wait when their lives are in danger and everything in them screams to do something? They do hold. They wait until Wallace gives the word, and then they launch their spears. The homemade weapons find their mark, and the opposing army, with all its wartime facilities, turn tail and run. What kind of leader is able to call people to wait on God in the face of real threat? When all their survival instincts are raging, what inner strength does a leader need to be able to access in order to stay calm, to quiet the primal instincts of others, and to create space for turning to God in the midst of such fierce human reactivity? Only a leader who has waited for God in the darkest moments of his own deep need, only a leader who has stood still and waited for God's deliverance in places where he or she feared for their very life, only the leader with inner spiritual authority that comes from his their own waiting can ask others to do the same. Moses was a man who had been trained in solitude. In this boot camp of the soul, he learned the restraint of waiting for the right time, even after he heard God's call. He did not jump the gun and return to Egypt too soon. He waited for God's instruction. It took a very long time. Finally, and this would have taken years, God had said to him, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who were seeking your life are dead." To wait until all those who oppose you are dead is a pretty good strategy in some cases, but most of us have not had much training in waiting, or at least not enough to prepare us for the help others in to help others wait in times when they feel highly threatened. Richard Rowe calls this waiting place liminal space. Liminal comes from the Latin word limina, which means threshold, liminal space, the place of waiting is. A unique spiritual position where human beings hate to be, but where biblical God is always leading them, is when you have left to try the tried and true, but have not yet been able to replace it with anything else. It is when you are finally out of the way. It is when you are between your old comfort zone and any possible new answer. If you are not trained in how to hold anxiety, how to live with ambiguity, how to entrust and wait, you will run anything to flee this terrible cloud of unknowing. In solitude, we learn to wait on God for our own life so that when our leadership brings us to the place where the only option for us as people is to wait on God, we believe it all the way down to the bottom of our beings because we have met God in the waiting place rather than running away or giving in to panic or deceiving ourselves into thinking things are better than they are. We are able to stand firm and believe God in a way that makes it possible for others to follow suit. It's a sobering thing to ask ourselves this question: have I learned enough about how to wait on God in my own life to be able to call others to wait when that is what they truly need? Have I done enough spiritual journeying to lead people on this part of the journey? That's interesting, isn't it? Have we done enough of our own journey to lead others in the journey that they're going through? That's the challenge. And what journeys have we gone through that we feel we have come through that we should be helping people with? We're often trying to help people in areas that we actually haven't dealt with ourselves. And sometimes we're trying to fix people and the situations when we don't actually have an idea of how to do that because we haven't allowed God to take us through that journey ourselves. It's an interesting thing where sometimes we put ourselves in positions of trying to help people, but sometimes we can cause more damage and more harm because we're actually not equipped to be able to handle people, handle that situation. Moses was able to say to the children of Israel in this moment of absolute chaos, he was able to say, "Be still. God's going to fight the battle," because he knew what it was to be still in the presence of God. My challenge to you as we finish this chapter, as we look at the next chapter, and we finish this book over the next few days, my challenge to you is that we have a solitude moment here, an opportunity to get into God's presence, that we could know how to be still in the midst of chaos, that when it comes to helping people in the future, when it comes to leading people into the promised land, when it comes to leading people out of bondage, that we are equipped to be able to do that. That we know that we can say to people, "Be still and wait on God, trust in Him," because we have done that ourselves. That would be my challenge to you, my challenge to me. Like, are we people that are equipped to be able to tell people to wait in the midst of the battle and watch God fight it for us because we know that He's done that for us? Or are we able to advise people on a similar kind of basis in different areas because we too have allowed God to deal with that area in our life? And my question to you, or my challenge to you is, if the answer is no, then maybe we should stop trying to help people in areas that we have not allowed God to take us on the journey on yet. Bless you guys. I hope that you enjoyed today's reading of chapter, what we're on, chapter 6. Um, Bless you guys. How are you guys doing? There's a few people online. I hope you're doing well. Um, I hope you're encouraged through what we're doing here as a church and what we're doing online. I hope that you are doing well in your faith and praying for breakthrough, praying for these times of solitude that you're going through, that you'll get stronger with God and seek God through it and stuff. Um, and yeah, really, really just keep seeking God, keep spending time with Him, please. Like, I know people are struggling at times now. I know that it's getting into week 2 now, and we're starting to struggle and struggle with the solitude, struggle with finding things to do, and all sorts of other things that we've got to do. But I just want to say to you guys, just um, like, this is a great opportunity just to get into His presence and rest in His presence. Actually, a really good opportunity to rest. Just rest your body, rest your mind, rest your spirit, and just get into His presence and spend time in His Word. Spend time, if there are things like this going on, fellowship in online. Bless you guys. We'll be back again tomorrow morning. I'm not sure if Ian's going to be doing his teaching. I think he will be. So we'll just say that Ian will be doing his teaching tonight, 6 or 7 o'clock. I'll make people aware online and on our message service that we have, so that people can be aware of that. If it isn't on, obviously we'll let you know that as well. Um, yeah, we'll see you again in the morning. If not, with Ian later on. Bless you guys. Take care.